May 25, 1945. The Pacific seethed with conflict. Waves slammed against steel sides while the sky over Okinawa thundered not from weather, but from anti-aircraft batteries tearing into the clouds. American sailors barked commands over the high, keening scream of kamikaze aircraft plunging through smoke and flak. Among those pilots was one young man, Kawaru Hagawa, 22, assigned to a suicide mission. He expected to die that day. Inside, his zero rain hammered the canopy. The stench of engine oil and sweat filled the cockpit. His hands shook, not from panic but from the knowledge that each inhale could be his last. That was the mission. That was the honor. In a pocket lay a poem he'd written the night before, farewell, not to the nation but to his mother. No tears for the trees in bloom. Think about where the fallen flowers have gone. At exactly 2:47 p.m., American fire struck his plane. Flames burst beneath the wings. Metal shrieked. The sea rose to meet him like the open maw of death. And then there was silence only, the hiss of water and the faint patter of boots on deck. Two figures bobbed in the waves, one motionless, the other barely clinging to life. The sailors aboard USS Callahan raised their rifles. This should have been the end. He had prepared for death. What followed, however, stunned everyone. Before the fall, before the flames, before the crash and the hush, there had been a boy. Kawaru Hagawa grew up in a quiet village outside Nagano. He loved to sketch airplanes. His father taught school. His mother sewed garments. They lived modestly but with dignity. When war arrived, everything shifted. He was 17 when the Empire summoned him. At 18, he entered flight training. By 20, he was no longer a child. The uniform erased that. So did the doctrine. At the academy, they taught more than flying. They taught fate. To fall was to flourish. An instructor intoned, "To die is to serve. A noble death is a beautiful one." Each morning they saluted the emperor. Each evening they sang of cherry blossoms drifting down. It was verse and venom. Kawaru wasn't the finest pilot, but he was dutiful, steady, and quiet, and that made him ideal. Ideal for a one-way mission. They were called Tokubetsu Kogikade, special attack units. The Americans used the simpler term kamikaze, divine wind. The day Kawaru received his assignment, he did not cry. He bowed, nodded, and accepted. That night he penned 3 letters, one for his commander, one for his closest friend Akira, and one for his mother. He folded each carefully, smoothing the edges with trembling fingers. "Dearest Okaya mother, I will fly tomorrow. Please do not grieve. I will become a flower and scatter for the emperor. Remember the river where we once walked? I hope it still runs clear. Your son always Then he took a brush and copied a haiku until the ink blurred. Rain in May. No tears for the trees in bloom. Think about where the fallen flowers have gone. The next dawn, he and 4 others stood on the tarmac. Their aircraft sat in line like coffins waiting to fly. Officers offered each man a ceremonial cup of sake. Kawaru's hands trembled as he drank, not from fear. He had taught himself to think fear a weakness but from a heavy, humane weight in his chest. He looked toward Akira, 2 planes away. They exchanged a single nod. Then the engines roared. Kawaru climbed into his Zero. The cockpit smelled of petrol and cold metal. His scarf was tied snug, already damp with sweat. He adjusted his goggles and checked the photograph taped to his panel. Family, a dog, a sliver of ordinary life. The radio crackled. "Take care," the squadron leader murmured. The planes lifted one after another. Kawaru's wheels left the ground at 0900 hours. He knew the coordinates. The target, an American destroyer near Okinawa. He had studied its profile, the placement of guns on its deck. What he could not know was what would follow impact. He was not intended to survive. As land slid away beneath him, Kawaru clenched the stick. Clouds crowded the sky. Wind battered the plane. He pictured his mother sewing his school uniform when he was small. The river, her smile when he brought home rice cakes. He blinked rapidly. Do not hesitate, he told himself. Do not look back. By 1:45 p.m. they had visual contact with the enemy formation. Kawaru's heart raced, but his hands remained steady. He whispered, "This is my duty. This is my gift." Then the sky erupted. Flak detonated all around him. Black puffs shredded the air. One plane vanished in a ball of smoke. Another spun earthward, a trail of flame like a dying comet. Kawaru pressed on. The destroyer appeared. He dropped altitude, leveled his wings, and began his dive. Wind screamed over the canopy. His breathing slowed. His heart did not. He clenched his jaw, and then the left wing shuddered. A shell had struck. Smoke poured into the cockpit. The engine coughed. Instruments spun out of control. Kawaru wrestled for command, but gravity prevailed. The last sight he registered was the rising bow of USS Callahan, towering like a wall of steel. Then the ocean swallowed him. USS Callahan had weathered worse days, but this one felt cursed. It was the 3rd consecutive week of turmoil off Okinawa's coast. Suicide planes came like breakers. Relentless, unthinking, unstoppable. Every man aboard ran on caffeine, adrenaline, and fear. Conversation was hushed. Lieutenant Robert Ames, 24, stood at the radar console. He had learned to recognize the sound of approaching doom. A low, fast buzz that climbed. At 12:43 p.m., that sound returned. Incoming bogies, low altitude, bearing 247, the call announced. The alert rippled through the ship. Boots pounded the deck. Guns swung skyward. Fingers found triggers by reflex. Shouts rose, but the sea swallowed most of them. The Callahan was primed, high above. 5 specks marked against the gray, rapidly descending. Kamikaze. Someone muttered an observation, not a question. Each gunner fixed on a target. The enemy planes separated, diving with terrifying accuracy. One bore for a destroyer, farther south. Another peeled east. One came straight at them. Kawaru Hagawa, his plane wounded and trailing smoke like a dying star. Ames watched the screen, then the sky, then back again. His voice cracked. Guns 3 and 4. Fire now. The Callahan shuddered under the roar of its own defense. Shells detonated around the diving aircraft. One burst near a wing. Another struck true. The plane dipped, twisted, fell lower, and then missed. Short of impact, the kamikaze slammed into the sea in a thunderous splash. A plume of salt water shot up over the destroyer's deck. Men sprinted to the port rail, rifles raised, scanning the water. They expected wreckage, perhaps fire, but instead they saw motion. 2 heads, one body floated face down, limp. The other moved barely. Kawaru Hagawa clung to life. Blood ran from his scalp. His shoulder was mangled, his flight suit torn and sodden. Yet his eyes were open and fixed upon them. Jesus, a sailor whispered. One's alive. Lieutenant Ames brought his binoculars to his eyes and confirmed it. Could be a trick, another warned. Could be armed. Rifles were trained. Fingers hesitated. Orders hung in the air. Then Kawaru raised one hand, weak, slow, almost a twitch. A plea rather than a threat. Ames lowered his rifle. Get a boat in the water, he ordered. For a moment, everything held its breath. Then the deck sprang into motion. A rescue party was readied. 2 sailors lowered a small boat over the side. The sea slapped the hull as they shoved off toward the survivors. No one could say whether it was wise. No one cared. In that instant, war paused. The boat reached Kawaru first. His eyes fluttered. He tried to speak, but only salt water escaped. They seized his arms gently. He was too light, too limp. They laid him in the bottom of the boat and covered him with a tarp. One sailor checked for weapons. Another checked for a pulse still there. Back on deck, the crew watched wordlessly as the boat returned. This was the enemy, a kamikaze who had tried to kill them, and now he bled on their deck. No one voiced it, but everyone felt a shift. Kawaru was carried below. Medics set to work. Bandages, antiseptic, morphine. A young, wide-eyed sailor lingered and whispered, "Why are we saving him?" No one replied. Because, someone thought, deep down they already knew life must be preserved. The ship's infirmary was meant for American wounds, gunshots, burns, shrapnel, not for kamikaze pilots. Yet on that humid May day, Kawaru Hagawa became their unexpected patient in the Pacific. He arrived unconscious, chest barely rising, his left eye swollen shut, his shoulder bones shattered, but he breathed. "Let's get that flight suit off," the medic said, slicing through fabric. A small photograph slipped from the lining, a woman with gentle eyes and a soft smile, his mother. The medic paused, wiped the blood, and set it aside. There was shrapnel in his leg. Internal bleeding was possible. He needed fluids fast. Triage training took over. Saline, dressings, tourniquets, a morphine shot. A sailor stood in the doorway with arms crossed. "We're really patching him up after what he tried to do?" he asked. The medic did not look up. "He's bleeding. That's all I see." Down the corridor, whispers spread. Some sailors nodded in approval of the rescue. Others frowned. "He's the enemy. He tried to kill us. He's just a kid," someone muttered. Beneath the infirmary's flickering lights, Kawaru stirred. His breathing caught. His eyes fluttered open, confused and unfocused. Above him the roof was iron, not open sky or some promised afterlife. His thoughts raced. Was he dead, or trapped inside a dream? Then English words reached his ears. He turned slowly, groaning as pain lanced through his side. A medic leaned close and said, "You're okay, you're safe." Kawaru blinked, unable to follow every syllable but understanding the gentleness in the voice. It wasn't scorn or triumph, but concern. He tried to move and recoiled from the pain. His throat felt raw. He mouthed something in Japanese that no one could translate, though the terror in his eyes needed no interpreter. A sailor entered, carrying a canteen, knelt, and tipped it toward Kawaru's lips. The pilot drank, then coughed. The sailor grinned and offered, "Water's water, right?" Kawaru stared, bewildered. This man ought to have killed him. Why hadn't he? The sailor noticed Kawaru's confusion, tapped his chest, said Joe. Then tapped himself again, and made a flying gesture with his hands, accompanying it with a comic boom, and pointed at Kawaru, as if to say, "You crashed, we helped." Kawaru could only stare. Tears gathered not from pain, but from an ache worse than injury. He felt he had failed his nation, failed the emperor, failed the mission. He had been meant to die, yet here he lay in the belly of an American ship, wounded, alive, and the recipient of mercy. That night he closed his eyes and wished sleep had not returned him to waking. The next morning the ship's doctor checked him and noted his vitals were stable. A medic murmured that Kawaru had tried to tear at his stitches during the night and needed watching. Kawaru said nothing, staring at the bare wall. In his upbringing, death carried honor. Survival in this circumstance felt shameful. Living marked him as disgraced. But the Americans did not treat him as a defect or a monster, or even merely as the enemy. They treated him as a human. Days passed in quiet. The sailors avoided interrogation and rude curiosity. Instead, they brought meals and fresh dressings. One left an English-Japanese phrasebook on his cot. Kaworu hesitated, then opened it, and on the flyleaf found a message. Enemy or not, you're still human. Heal fast. Brother. There was no name. He shut the book and wept. Some nights later, a fever dream brought his mother to him in the garden, but she wept instead of smiled. He jolted awake, drenched in sweat, to find Joe sitting on a crate, smoking. Kaworu said nothing. Joe glanced over and asked if he'd been dreaming. Kaworu nodded. Joe rummaged in his shirt pocket and produced a photograph of a little girl, around 5 or 6, grinning with 2 missing teeth. My daughter, Joe said. Kaworu reached under his pillow and produced his own photograph of his mother. They sat together in silence, holding images. 2 enemies, 2 sons. 2 lives that in another life might have shared a meal instead of gunfire. In that quiet and understanding passed between them that war could not erase. Kaworu's wounds began to mend, but his mind remained fractured. By the 5th day aboard the Callahan he could sit upright. His arm was bandaged and his ribs still ached. He ate little and spoke less, watching the crew move through their routines. Jokes, quarrels, coffee-stained mornings, ordinary human things that made him more afraid than any battlefield. Imperial teachings had dehumanized Americans. They were supposed to be brutes without honor, yet the man who redressed his wounds did so gently. The cook brought him real rice and bowed slightly before setting food down. Joe smiled even when Kaworu did not. Kaworu once whispered too softly for others to catch. 2 days later he was moved to a larger hospital ship. The Callahan's crew watched the small boat pull away carrying their improbable ward. Joe stood at the rail and lifted a hand. Kaworu, unsure what else to do, returned the gesture. On the hospital ship USS Solace, the air felt clinical and cool. Kaworu was assigned to a section for prisoners, but it lacked the sterility of a cell. A young nurse tended his fever one night, tucking a blanket under his arm. When he murmured, confused, she offered a small smile and said, "You're welcome." That night, alone, he reached for the bandages around his abdomen and began to pull. Each tug burned. He almost completed the job when a remembered voice, Joe's small, rough phrase from earlier, echoed in his head. "You crash us." "Help!" He stopped, let the bandage fall, lay back, and cried for the first time since he was a child. The following morning, an American officer and a translator entered. "We are transferring you to a P camp," the officer announced. Kaworu nodded slowly. "You will not be harmed. You will be treated fairly." Kaworu lifted his eyes and, in shaky English, confessed, "I tried to kill." The translator hesitated, passed the words along, and the officer replied simply, "Yes, but you didn't. Now you live. That's enough." Those words echoed in Kaworu's chest for days. The P camp was not barbed wire hell. It enforced order, yes, but also afforded dignity, food, rules, and books. Kaworu kept to himself, wrote letters he doubted would arrive in Japan, and sketched not aircraft but the faces of the Americans who had rescued him. Joe, the cook, the nurse. Under stuttering lights he scrawled in his journal, "I lived, and that is the deepest rebellion against war." He began to speak with other Japanese prisoners, some bitter, some broken, a few with moments like his. Small human acts that cracked the armor of hatred. A guard shared a cigarette. A medic murmured sorry as he stitched. It was little, but it mattered. One evening, watching birds cross a fading orange sky, Kaworu thought of Akira, his friend who never came back, and of the officers who had seen him off. The Emperor's portrait, the cherry blossom songs. He had once believed he was ready to die. Now he found himself alive, wounded but somehow more complete than before. Decades later, the former enemy would be welcomed as a guest. Kaworu Hagawa spent years trying to bury the blaze, the cries. The moment the sea took him, and fate failed to finish what duty intended. He married, worked, raised children, and seldom spoke of the crash, the kindness, or the disgrace he felt for surviving. Yet memories returned louder with age. Approaching his 70s, he began to put pen to paper. Accounts of the war, the mission, and of the Americans who had shown him mercy. He kept those pages to himself until his youngest grandson asked, "Jichi-chan, did you ever fly a plane?" That question made him realize silence would not do. Through letters and translated phone calls, he sought the crew that had saved him. The USS Callahan had later been sunk by another kamikaze, though many sailors survived and kept meeting. In July 1995, a letter arrived. "Mr. Hagawa, we would be honored to have you at our reunion." It was signed simply, Joe. The reunion took place in Spokane, Washington, far from Okinawa. Kaworu traveled alone in a plain gray suit, carrying in his breast pocket the black and white photo of his mother that had once slipped from his bloodied flight jacket. He bore no banner, no apology, only memory. Inside the banquet room, the Callahan's veterans gathered, some leaning on canes, some walking with oxygen tanksmen in their 70s and 80s, trading stories softened by time. When Kaworu entered, a hush fell. Conversations paused and forks hovered midair. It was recognition, not fear. Kaworu bowed slightly. Then, a man rose. walking with a cane, a scar along his jaw, eyes wet with disbelief. "Kaworu?" he asked. Kaworu looked up. "Joe." For an instant, war evaporated. Joe stepped forward and enfolded him in a full, trembling embrace more than a soldier's greeting. It was the reunion of two boys who had survived a war neither wanted. The room responded with quiet applause, many wiping tears. Later, Kaworu spoke beneath a banner reading USS Callahan Reunion. 50 years of brotherhood, he told them. 50 years ago, I flew with the aim to die. I was taught that death was glory, that you were monsters, that mercy was weakness. But when you pulled me from the ocean, you did not beat me or shoot me. You treated my wounds and gave me water. One of you even smiled. That smile altered everything. He held up his mother's photograph. She prayed for my spirit because she believed I was dead. Because of you, I returned, and I carry her with me. I came not only to thank you, but to ask forgiveness for believing you less than human. I see now that was a lie. These faces, these men, these tears, this is the truth. Silence followed, reverent, not uneasy then. One by one, the veterans stood and saluted, not from duty, but from respect. Afterward, many approached Kaworu with outstretched, trembling hands. One old sailor produced a photograph taken from the deck on the day of the crash. "That's the boat that pulled you out," he said, voice breaking. "I was on it." Kaworu peered at the grainy image and saw his own limp form being lifted from the sea. "I never saw this," he whispered. "It's yours," the man replied. "You earned it." As the evening wound down, Kaworu and Joe found themselves on an outside bench beneath the stars. The air was cool, and cicadas chirped just as they had back on Okinawa. The roof above him was iron, not open sky or some promised heaven. His thoughts raced. Was he dead or trapped in a fevered dream? Then English voices reached him. He turned his head and groaned as a stabbing pain shot through his side. A medic leaned close and said, "You're all right. You're safe." Kaworu blinked, unable to follow every word but sensing the kindness in the tone. It wasn't triumph or malice but care. He tried to move and flinched from the pain. His throat felt raw and he mouthed something in Japanese that no one could translate, though the terror in his eyes spoke plainly. A sailor entered, holding a canteen, knelt, and tipped it toward Kaworu's lips. The pilot drank and then began to cough. The sailor smiled and said, "Water, right." Kaworu stared, confused. This man should have killed him. Why hadn't he? The sailor noticed the look, tapped his chest and said, "Joe," tapped himself, made a flying gesture, and a comic boom, then pointed at Kaworu as if to say, "You crashed. We helped." Kaworu could only stare. Tears gathered not from pain but from a deeper ache. He felt he had failed his country, the emperor, his mission. He had been meant to die, yet he lay in the belly of an American ship, wounded, alive, and shown mercy. That night, he closed his eyes and wished he had not awakened. The next morning, the ship's doctor checked his vitals and declared them stable. A medic muttered that Kaworu had tried to pull at his stitches during the night and needed watching. Kaworu said nothing, staring at the bare wall. In his upbringing, death brought honor. Surviving felt like disgrace. Living made him a source of shame. Yet the Americans did not treat him as a disgrace, a monster, or merely the enemy. They treated him like a fellow human. For days he lay quietly. The sailors did not interrogate or mock. They brought food and fresh dressings. One even left an English-Japanese phrasebook on his cot. Kaworu hesitated, opened it, and found on the inside cover a note, "Enemy or not, you're still human. Heal fast, brother." No signature. He closed the book and wept. Some nights later, a fever brought a dream of his mother in the garden, weeping rather than smiling. He woke drenched in sweat to find Joe sitting on a crate, smoking. Kaworu said nothing. Joe glanced over and asked if he had been dreaming. Kaworu nodded. Joe reached into his shirt pocket and produced a photograph of a little girl, about 5 or 6, grinning with 2 missing teeth. "My daughter," Joe said. Kaworu reached under his pillow, produced his photograph of his mother, and they sat in silence, photos in hand. 2 enemies, 2 sons, 2 people who in another life might have shared a meal instead of bullets. In that quiet, a bond passed between them that war could not erase. Kaworu's wounds began to mend while his mind remained fractured. By the 5th day aboard Callahan, he could sit up, his arm heavily bandaged and his ribs still aching. He ate little and spoke less, watching the crew go about ordinary routines, jokes, arguments over coffee, ordinary human things that frightened him more than battle. Imperial teaching had painted Americans as soulless brutes. The men who dressed his wounds were gentle. The cook brought him real rice and bowed slightly when setting the tray down. And Joe always smiled even when Kaworu could not. Why Kaworu once whispered too softly for others to hear? 2 days later, he was transferred to a larger hospital ship. The Callahan's crew watched the small boat pull away, carrying their unlikely passenger. Joe stood at the rail and lifted a hand. Kaworu, unsure what else to do, returned the gesture. Aboard the hospital ship USS Solace, the air felt clinical and cool. Kaworu was placed in a section for prisoners, but it did not feel like a cell. A young nurse tended his fever one night, tucking a blanket around him. When he murmured in confusion, she offered a small smile and said, "You're welcome." That night, he reached for the bandages around his stomach and began to pull. Each tug burned like fire. He almost finished when Joe's remembered gesture, "You crash us, help," returned to him. He stopped, let the bandage fall, lay back, and cried for the first time since childhood. The following morning, an officer and a translator came to his cot. "We are transferring you to a P camp," the officer said. Kaworu nodded slowly. "You will not be harmed. You will be treated fairly." In shaky English, he answered. "I tried to kill," the translator relayed it, and the officer replied simply, "Yes, but you didn't. Now you live. That's enough." Those words echoed in Kaworu's chest for weeks. The P camp was not barbed wire cruelty. It enforced discipline, but offered dignitaries food and books. Kaworu kept mostly to himself, wrote letters he doubted would reach Japan, and sketched not aircraft but the faces of the Americans who had saved him. Joe, the cook, the nurse. Under flickering lights he scrawled in his journal, "I lived, and that is the deepest rebellion against war." He began to speak with other Japanese prisoners, some bitter, some broken, a few who remembered small acts of kindness, a guard sharing a cigarette, a medic whispering sorry while stitching a wound. Those little moments cracked the armor of hatred. One evening, beneath an orange dying sky, he thought of Akira, his friend who never returned, of the officers who had sent him off, the emperor's portrait, and the songs of falling cherry blossoms. He had once believed he was ready to die. Now he found himself alive, wounded, yet strangely more whole than before. Decades later, the former enemy would come as a guest. Kaworu Hagawa spent years burying the blaze, the screams, the instant the sea took him, and fate failed to finish its work. He married, worked, raised children, and rarely spoke of the crash, the kindness he received, or the shame of survival. But with age, those ghosts knocked louder. Approaching his 70s, he began to write accounts of the war, the mission, and the Americans who had shown him mercy and kept the pages hidden. Then his youngest grandson asked, "Gichi-chan, did you ever fly a plane?" Kaworu realized silence was no answer. Through letters and translated calls, he sought the crew that had rescued him. Though USS Callahan was later sunk by another kamikaze, many crew members survived and held reunions. In July 1995, a letter arrived. "Mr. Hagawa, we would be honored to have you at our reunion." It was signed simply, Joe. The reunion took place in Spokane, Washington, far from Okinawa. Kaworu traveled alone in a plain gray suit, the black and white photograph of his mother tucked in his breast pocket. He carried no flag or apology, only memory. Inside the banquet room, the Callahan veterans gathered, some leaning on canes, some moving with oxygen tanksmen in their 70s and 80s, trading stories softened by time. When Kaworu entered, a hush fell, conversations stopped and forks paused mid. It was recognition, not fear. He bowed slightly. A man rose, a cane in hand, a scar along his jaw, eyes wet with disbelief. "And ask Kaworu answered. "Joe." For an instant, war vanished. Joe stepped forward and enfolded him in a full, trembling embrace, not a formal soldier's greeting, but the reunion of two boys who had survived a war neither wanted. The room responded with quiet applause and tears. Later, Kaworu spoke beneath a banner reading USS Callahan Reunion, 50 years of brotherhood. He told them, 50 years ago I flew with the intention to die. I was taught that death was glory, that you were monsters, that mercy was weakness. But when you pulled me from the sea, you did not beat me or shoot me. You tended my wounds and gave me water. One of you smiled, and that smile changed everything." He lifted his mother's photograph. "She prayed for my spirit thinking I was gone. Because of you, I returned, and I carry her with me. I came not only to thank you, but to ask forgiveness for believing you less than human. I know now that belief was a lie. These faces, these men, these tears, this is the truth." Silence followed, reverent rather than awkward. Then one by one the veterans rose and saluted, not from duty, but from respect. Afterwards many approached Kaworu with trembling hands. One old sailor produced a photo taken from the deck on the day of the crash. "That's the boat that pulled you out," he said, voice breaking. "I was on it." Kaworu peered at the grainy image and saw his own limp form being hauled from the water. "I never saw this," he whispered. "It's yours," the man said. "You earned it." As the evening wound down, Kaworu and Joe found themselves on a bench beneath the stars, the air cool and the cicada singing like they once had over Okinawa. Joe struck a match and lit a cigarette, then held one out. Kaworu declined with a small smile. "I quit when I learned I could live," he joked. Joe laughed softly. They sat without speaking for a while. Then Joe said quietly, "I used to wonder what happened to you after we put you on that boat." Kaworu turned to him. "I wondered what would have happened if you hadn't," he replied. Joe inhaled deeply and said, "You know, I used to think I'd saved a soldier that day. Now I think I saved a teacher, a father, a man." Kaworu nodded, eyes glistening. "You saved me from more than death," he said. "You saved me from what I might have become." Beneath that peaceful American sky, two men who had once been enemies simply shared the hush of truce, a life that shouldn't have continued. When Kaworu returned to Japan, he did not come home as a hero, a martyr, or even merely a survivor. He came back altered. The weeks after he left the P camp were muted. No parades, no meadows. No ceremonies, only silence and suspicion. In a nation still reeling from defeat, his presence made people uneasy. A kamikaze who had not died. Neighbors avoided meeting his eyes. Former classmates bowed politely and kept walking. One passenger on a train muttered, "Failed pilot." Kaworu said nothing. The hardest glance, though, was his mother's when she first saw him. No relief. No gladness, only stunned disbelief, as if she had encountered a ghost. She had already mourned him, burned incense, prayed at a shrine, bid farewell. Now he stood in her doorway, alive and incomplete. Rebuilding trust took years. Finding purpose took longer. Kaworu did not return to flying. He did not publish memoirs or seek the spotlight. He opened a small stationery shop and modest selling notebooks, ink, paper, and pens for others to write their lives, while his story stayed mostly shut. When boys came into the shop and fiddled with the model planes in the back, he would pause and remember not the blaze or the mission but the faces. Joe, the medic, the nurse who smiled, the man who had saluted him despite knowing what he had intended. Those memories lingered. In the 1970s, a history teacher who had read of his survival invited him to speak to students. Kaworu hesitated, then accepted. Before 20 quiet teenagers, he said in measured tones, "I was trained to fly into death. When death refused me, I had to learn how to live, and that was harder." One student asked, "Were the Americans as cruel as we were told?" Kaworu paused and answered, "No. The Americans who pulled me from the water were the first to see me as a person, and that made me want to be one." From that point, he spoke once a year, never loudly, never theatrically, simply offering the sober truth of a man whose life had been spared not only by mercy but by respect. By the 1990s, Kaworu had become a quiet emblem of reconciliation. He was invited to conferences, peace forums, and interfaith panels. He turned away from labels, calling himself merely fortunate. But people listened because his voice carried a rare calm earned by passing through fire and emerging unbroken. After his reunion with the crew of the Callahan, his story reached wider audiences. Articles, documentaries, a television interview, headlines proclaimed, "Enemy no more, the kamikaze who was saved and forgave." Kaworu paid little heed to headlines. He treasured letters. They arrived from the United States and Japan, from veterans and children. One note read, "Dear Mr. Hagawa, I am 12. My grandfather died in Okinawa. After hearing your story, I asked my mother if we could light a candle for him and for the pilot who flew against him. Thank you for teaching me to see the other side." Kaworu kept that letter in his wallet until his last day. In his later years, he walked every morning to the park near his home, sitting on the same bench beneath the same cherry tree. Each spring, when the blossoms fell, he would murmur the poem he had written at 22. No tears for the trees in bloom. Think about where the fallen flowers have gone. Now, at 87, the lines meant something new, not an ode to beauty and death, but a quiet acceptance of life. He died in his sleep one spring in 2010. His children found his journal, his flight photograph, and the dictionary with Joe's handwriting tucked inside. They held a simple service, no military banners, no rising sun, only family, and laid beside him a folded American flag and a letter that read, "Kaworu Hagawa was never our enemy. He was proof that war does not always win." USS Callahan.